Mad magazine was the creation of comic artist Harvey Kurtzman, who wanted it to be a satirical antidote to the generally humourless formulaic comics of the time. He'd been working on titles such as Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat for EC Comics, and publisher William Gaines thought enough of Kurtzman's idea to give it a trial run, and the first issue was published in 1952. Mad didn't carry any advertising, so the print budget was tiny, and only the front and back covers were in colour. The early issues were entirely in comic book format and illustrated by Kurtzman and a quartet of other like-minded comic artists. But Mad was very much his concept, and not only were the first 23 issues entirely scripted by him, but the others worked from his directorial layouts and sketches. Of the four other contributors, Bill, also known as Will Elder, was Kurtzman's closest ally, and his natural inking style and sense of humour weren't far removed from Kurtzman's own. Elder was also capable of parodying the techniques of others, which came in particularly handy for satirical purposes. On occasion, his likeness to the originals was so close, it's surprising he was never sued for copyright infringement. Wally Wood was even more versatile than Elder and had a strong reputation for both representational and humorous styling in his work for the comics. Wood was a real master of expressive, tightly controlled black line illustration, and from the very beginning he was an invaluable asset to the team. But as a comic artist of considerable experience, he wasn't wild about working under Kurtzman's direction. The same was true of John Severin, another EC veteran, who had spent quite a few years working on many science fiction and war comics. Severin's work appeared in 9 of Mad's first 10 issues, and he produced quite a few memorable strips in that time. But ultimately Kurtzman's control got too much for him, and he quit after an argument in 1954. Last and arguably most significant of this group, Jack Davis had been with EC Comics since 1950, and he was best known for his distinctive work on Tales from the Crypt. But at Mad he was able to indulge the humorous side of his work, which had only been hinted at in his horror output. Davis's style was particularly manic, and even under Kurtzman's direction, his complex inking made his work particularly recognisable. In 1954, Mad abandoned the comic book layout in favour of a more versatile magazine format, which allowed for greater diversity in the illustration styles it used and how they were displayed on the pages. But only a year after the changeover, Harvey Kurtzman quit after an acrimonious dispute with William Gaines over money. Of the original team, only Wally Wood remained, although Jack Davis returned almost immediately when he realised that with Kurtzman gone, he would have much greater creative freedom. Both he and Wally Wood took full advantage of this in the early transitional period under new editor Al Feldstein, who despite his own cartoon credentials gave his artists free rein. Wood drifted away in the early 60s, but Jack Davis stayed with Mad for the rest of his career, and his sophisticated ink drawings were crucial to the magazine's success for several decades to come. Al Feldstein hired a much more diverse group of illustrators and a team of writers to supply them with new material. In 1956, Alfred E. Newman became the magazine's official mascot and cover star. The character was heavily based on a humorous image which had been around for many years before Mad adopted him, and 2 artists in particular were commissioned to paint covers featuring his imbecilic face. Norman Mingo was already an established successful advertising and pin-up artist, and he was the first to immortalise Newman on Mad's covers, and he continued to do so for more than a decade. Similarly, Frank Kelly Freas was a respected fantasy and science fiction artist, who in his association with Mad produced pretty much every cover painting not created by Mingo. Both also worked extensively on the covers of the numerous paperback book compilations of reprinted material published by William Gaines to make more money. Of the new artists taken on by Feldstein, Bob Clarke was among the first, and from his arrival in 1956 onwards, he became a mainstay of the magazine as it rose in circulation. Clarke had a light expressive touch and a clean calligraphic modernist style, which was tailor-made to work well with the more text-driven features of the magazine, and he was a popular partner with the writers of Mad well into the 1960s. MORT DRUCKER was also taken on in 1956, and he immediately became one of Mad's greatest and most popular assets. His early work for Mad revealed little evidence of his spectacular talent for caricature, but it soon started creeping into early strips, and before long he was heavily relied upon for many of the film parodies, which were a popular feature of the magazine for the next half-century. Like Jack Davis and Bob Clarke, MORT DRUCKER didn't write his own material, and he depended on being fed scripts by the likes of Dick DeBartolo and Frank Jacobs, whose ludicrously complex narratives Drucker visualised with apparent ease and attention to detail. Billed as Mad's maddest artist, Don Martin was the third significant recruit in 1956, and he stayed for the next 3 decades. Martin wrote most of his own scripts, and his surreal sequential narrative work proved to be hugely popular, featuring 2 or 3 times in almost every issue. His drawing style was both bizarre and distinctive, and was typified by a sameness in the appearance of all his characters, male or female, and an endless capacity for outlandish comic sound effects. But in 1987 he too had a serious dispute with William Gaines over non-payment of royalties for the reprinted collections of his work, and that was the end of his association with Mad. Dave Berg had previously been assistant to comic giants Will Eisner and Stan Lee, but in 1957 Mad gave him the opportunity to establish his own visual identity. And that identity was a distinctive hybrid of representational and comic, which made his characters capable of particularly subtle facial expression. He also wrote his own narratives and dialogue, and in 1961 he created his most popular series, The Lighter Side, which had a gentle but telling satirical and occasionally moralistic edge. Dave Berg had a remarkably long run of 46 years at Mad, up to his death in 2002. 1957 was also the year George Woodbridge joined, and he lasted almost as long as Berg with a 44-year association. Like Berg, Woodbridge played down the manic exaggeration of anatomy and posing found in some of the others' work, and although this made his illustration less recognisable, it also made him a popular choice with the writers of some of the more sophisticated social satires of American daily life which appeared in the magazine. And starting in 1958, possibly the least known of the Mad artists, Phil Interlandi, provided Mad with sequential illustrations for the scenes we'd like to see feature. His appearance in Mad was only occasional, as he was more often to be found in the pages of Playboy, but his light gestural style, plausible anatomy and talent for storyboarding were well suited to these dialogue-free film parodies. Mad's longest-serving artist, Al Jaffee, had actually first arrived at Mad in 1955, but left almost immediately in the wake of Harvey Kurtzman's departure. But in 1958 he came back and became a regular fixture for decades to come. Jaffee had a very agreeable and generally good-natured approach to his character design, and he was equally at home with pen or brush. In 1964 he created his longest-running Mad feature, The Fold-In, which was usually printed on the inside back cover. This involved the reader folding the page as instructed so that a new previously hidden image and message presented itself. And as a response to the Vietnam War, he also created the military comedy Hawks and Doves in 1969. Joe Orlando had been an assistant to Wally Wood and made his debut for Mad in 1960. Orlando was cast in a similar stylistic mould to Bob Clarke and was a useful regular contributor who could turn his hand to most forms of visual humour for the best part of a decade before he left in 1969. Antonio Prajas had been Cuba's foremost political cartoonist, but when Castro seized power, he was accused of secretly working for the CIA. Wisely, Prajas left Cuba for New York in 1960. A few weeks later he walked into Mad's offices and walked out with a cheque for his first 3 Spy vs. Spy cartoons. He continued writing and drawing this immensely popular, radically abstracted feature until 1986, when he was forced to retire due to illness. Jack Rickard was a key contributor to Mad for more than 2 decades. His early advertising work had attracted the attention of Mad, and he joined the magazine in 1961. Rickard was another particularly versatile artist, with strength in both linear and painted illustration, and he contributed to many articles and features, and also painted around 35 covers in his time at Mad until his death 22 years later. Paul Coker also appeared in 1961, and although he had a style almost as eccentric and distinctive as Don Martin's, it was always accessible to the mainstream, with deceptively loose calligraphic lines and a bulbous look to all of his images. Unlike Martin, the further he got from reality, the more his images resonated, and he had great success with his long-running Horrifying Clichés feature. In 1968, he illustrated the Mad paperback Mad for Better or Worse with writer Frank Jacobs, and it was the first of 8 all-new paperbacks drawn by Coker. My copy remains a battered but treasured possession. Sergio Aragones left Mexico in 1962, and in 1963 he headed for Mad's offices, hoping to sell some of his cartoons. Al Feldstein liked what he saw, and Aragones instantly became a contributor. His reputation at Mad was based on 2 features. There was the Mad Look At series featuring 4 to 5 pages of speechless gag strips that are all related to a single subject, and there was the even more popular drawn-out dramas, or marginals, which were laid out around the drawn panels of the magazine. All his work was particularly recognisable for its apparently hasty scribbled style, and over several decades with Mad he created many thousands of these illustrations. Last up is Angelo Torres, who didn't join Mad until 1969. Like MORT DRUCKER, he had an accurate and expressive talent for caricature, and among his other contributions, he too was a popular choice to illustrate many of the TV and movie parodies that featured up to his departure in 2005. Which brings us to the end of the video, and as it turns out, also the end of Mad. The news didn't really come as a surprise. Mad had had a run of 67 years, and in 1974 its circulation was more than 2 million. But by the start of the 21st century, it had become a fraction of that, despite still featuring the work of some truly great contemporary artists. And Mad may be gone, but I sincerely hope it won't be forgotten.